we've got the wonderful Jennifer McBride on our podcast today, and she's going to talk to us about a number of wonderful things that she started doing, including becoming an academic excellence, a teaching excellence lead at the University of Manchester, being only one of two people who have this role at the university. And also possibly we can get into some neuropsychological research that she's done in the past. So we'd love to know more about that. I'm joined as always by my wonderful co-host, Marshall Lester. And so let's get started.
Welcome to the podcast.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to be here as well. On my end, let me just start off with the first question. How did you get into academia? How is it that this whole thing started for you as you transition into this position that you're in right now?
Okay, so a bit of an origins kind of story, I suppose.
Origin story, that's right.
Yeah, so I've had a relatively traditional route, I would say, into academia. So actually, when I was a child, the only thing that I ever wanted to do when I was growing up was become a doctor, a medical doctor. And so for my A-levels, I did chemistry, biology, maths, and I was sort of encouraged to take a fourth A-level. I'm older than I care to admit. This was back in the day when most people did 3 A-levels and you might get to do a fourth. And my school had just started offering psychology as an A-level. And I thought, right, I'll do chemistry, biology and maths because that's what you need to do if you want to be a doctor. And I did psychology very much as my kind of fourth extra kind of subject because I thought that looks interesting. Let's have a go. And then I just absolutely loved it. And I was sort of thinking about what I was going to do with my life. I still don't know what I'm going to do with my life. But I thought, actually, if I do end up being a medical doctor, having started in psychology could actually be really useful for that field. Having a doctor who has also studied psychology, I think could be really helpful.
Yeah.
So I thought, I'll go and do a psychology degree, and then I'll think about whatever it is that I want to do after that. And I did a psychology degree, and I just sort of never really looked back, to be honest. I just realised that I found it so fascinating how we work. And I think that was a large part about why I wanted to be a doctor, not only because I wanted to help people, and I still very much do. It's one of the reasons I love teaching so much, but it's also because I just had a fundamental drive to understand how we work. And I think that's why I was kind of particularly attracted to the study of psychology. So I started out with a traditional 3-year BSc in psychology. I did it at Cardiff University, which was fantastic. I had just had such a great experience there. And then I didn't really know what I wanted to do after that. And it was a chance conversation with one of my lecturers. And it was when I was doing my 3rd-year project, actually, that I realised that I quite like this research stuff. This was quite interesting. I got to find out things that we didn't know, and I got to actually kind of find out the new stuff about how we worked. But I didn't know I didn't know what a PhD was. I didn't know that you could be a researcher. This wasn't something anyone in my family or my friends had done. And it was a chance conversation with one of my lecturers. And then I followed up with my project supervisor and sort of said, so what's this PhD thing all about? And they were very fair, and they gave me really good advice. They said, right, well, for a start, how are your grades? You know, are you likely to succeed if you try to do this? Because it's really competitive. But actually, I've since come to learn that I think most things that we want to do are competitive. I'm not sure that's a reason for it to put anyone off ever. But he sort of said, yeah, this is the process. This is how you do it. And so I did. And I did a PhD in attention and learning and memory at the University of Bristol, where I was particularly interested in visual search. If either of you can cast your minds back to visual search from your year 1 lectures in attention, that was what I was particularly interested in. But I was really interested in what happened between visual searches. So when human beings like us, when we come on into the lab and we're sort of measuring something like visual search, we're coming in with a whole load of context. So, but that context can be the context of our life, but it might also be what happened on the immediately preceding trial. And then I started thinking about questions about, well, what if the immediately preceding trial was really difficult? How does that affect your performance in the next trial? And I realized that, and again, if you can cast your minds back to pop out in visual search, this is where the target seems to jump out at you. It's really easy to find. And this was supposedly pre-attentive. That's what I told you, at least in year one lectures previously. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But actually, you can prime pop out. So if the previous trial, if the target on the previous trial was the same target, you are faster to find it. It pops out even faster. And pop out's supposed to be automatic, right? It's immediate.
Yes.
No, it isn't. Actually, it depends on what's happened on the immediately preceding trial. So that's really what my PhD was about. It was about the context of visual search. How do we learn about objects in our visual environment and then use that to guide our behaviour? And those are the things that got me so interested in psychology kind of in the first place. And then after my PhD, and during my PhD, really, I became interested in what happened after that. So how does our vision, our perception, our attention, like why is that useful? The only reason it's useful is if it affects our behaviour, if it affects our action. So then I became interested in the next step in the process, in the action step of the process. So when I was a postdoc, I was looking more at how we control our actions. So for example, and if you take the clinical cases in neuropsychology year 3 optional unit, you'll have me talking to you about this some more. But for example, I can put a coffee cup on the table in front of us here, and I can demonstrate in the laboratory that you are primed to reach out and grasp that coffee cup by the handle. And I can show you that in the lab through reaction time and accuracy measures.
So it's almost like a natural desire to do that, as opposed to, I don't know, grab it from the top.
No, you take it from the handle.
Is like prime, ready to go.
So the term that often gets used in the literature is affordance. So the coffee cup affords an action. If the handle particularly is on, say, the right-hand side, and even more so if you are right-handed, that is an even stronger kind of primed action. And we can demonstrate that this happens. But then that leads us to a fundamental question, right? Which is, why don't we grasp every coffee cup handle that we see? Given that I can demonstrate that you are primed to do so, why don't we? And then from there, how do we control our actions? What goes wrong in neuropsychological patients when they cannot control their actions? Or then we get into the realms of impulsivity, which is something that varies in the healthy population as well as in the neuropsychological population. So what are these differences? How do we control our behaviour? And is it conscious? And I get into all kinds of realms adjacent to free will in those kind of lectures in final year. And is it as free as we like to think that it is?
That is really interesting. And I remember during your lectures, there were people who, for example, they see a coffee cup and they just can't help but pick it up, even if it's not theirs, for instance.
Utilisation behaviour.
Right.
Yes,
right.
Well remembered, Hugo.
And coats and doors and stuff.
Yes,
right? That
exactly.
That's really memorable.
That part. So I guess for me, then the question is, given that if we have some neurological patients, if they have a particular disorder, so something like corticobasal syndrome, or if there is some resection, particularly of the medial frontal lobes, and again, I get all into this in the final year unit, but medial in this context just means middle, right? So we're looking at the middle part of the brain. Medial frontals towards the front. So these are the kind of brain areas that we're looking at. And these brain areas have long been associated with control of action. And so if there's some damage to these areas, suppose a patient has had a tumour resected from these areas, or there's degeneration of this region. One thing that we tend to find is that these patients might have something like a dysexecutive syndrome or a utilisation behaviour. So the example I gave in the lecture is of my boss when I was a postdoc, actually, taking off his glasses, folding them up and putting them on putting them on the table in front of the patient. And the instruction to the patient is, I would like you to do nothing. And patients with these dysexecutive syndromes, these utilisation behaviours, don't tend to do nothing. Instead, they tend to pick up the glasses, open up the legs and put them on their face.
Wow.
And especially if you then ask these patients, why did you do that? They will often confabulate a reason. So this then kind of raises questions that if we know that these patients do act on these afforded actions that are there in the environment, we know that healthy individuals like you and me are primed to do so, but we don't. What's the mechanism that means that we do not perform these actions, but these patients do?
So there seems to be almost like competing forces within the mind.
Exactly.
So from my understanding, it's like the control that part of your brain has is less control and it's more the inhibition of an action that you would have done otherwise.
Inhibition.
So it's not like it's choosing yes or no. It's just inhibiting the yes.
Exactly. So I think when I kind of came into this area, I kind of had the impression that if you imagine a really simple situation where you've got a stimulus and two possible courses of action, I think initially I would think that there would need to be some strengthening of the one that is chosen. Whereas actually, and I now think that a fundamental component of this behaviour might be an inhibition or a squashing of the one that is not chosen. But actually, I think a lot of that can be done automatically without conscious awareness. But that's something that will require diagrams, I think, to do a good job of explaining and watch out for what we cover in year 3.
That's really fascinating. One thing that when I was going to your lectures and I found really interesting was that you have the ability to make cognitive science visual, which is something that seems quite difficult to do because everything is happening within the mind, right?
Okay.
It's just, it has effects on the environment. So I remember, for example, the Piazza del Duomo, in which
the neglect
patients,
study.
Yeah, that's right. Patients with hemispatial neglect have difficulty seeing or at least remembering the other side of the screen.
Right.
The other side of the picture. That they were.
The imagined space, in fact.
That's right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I find that to be a really fascinating and just one of my favorite components of teaching. I happen to do teaching as well, and to some extent, I'm in a lucky position where I can do that. It is fun. And I always notice that people who have that ability to visualize concepts which would normally just sit on paper as this happens and then this happens, have the capacity to actually inspire students to understand what's going on. And I recall that as part of your role, you're trying to do that at a university level to help students actually understand the concepts that they're learning and to support their career paths in the future. So I was wondering how your understanding of cognition and the background that you've described now fits into this new role that you have, where cognition and your teaching, I'm guessing, is essential and foundational in informing kind of research that you do.
There's an awful lot to unpack in that question, so I'm going to have a go at speaking to this, but if I'm going in the wrong direction, please just kind of let me know and we'll get back to where we're hoping to get to. So yes, I mean, I think fundamentally, because I'm interested in how people work, I think that means that I'm just always thinking about what's going to be the best way to support people to do the things that we're trying to get them to do. And actually, I think the role of the university lecturer is different in different contexts. So just to give you a really simple example, in year 1, and I was teaching year 1, semester 1, and actually this year I gave the students first ever lecture at university. They'd had the first content lecture. They would have had things in Welcome Week, but it's like, okay, I'm getting you first. You have not probably done this before. And some of the students in those lectures, some have studied psychology before at A-level or the equivalent, some have not. We don't require psychology A-level to do the courses that I'm teaching, but some students will have seen some of these concepts before. So the challenge actually for a lecturer, if they're teaching a year 1 lecture, is to make sure that we don't lose any of the students if they haven't studied psychology before. You absolutely must start from the beginning and not assume that any of the students have got background knowledge, but while being mindful that many of the students do. And so you don't want those students to get bored and to not be challenging those students. So, I mean, you might have picked up the way I tend to do this in my own teaching, is that we cover absolutely everything that's needed, but we probably move fairly quickly.
We move fairly quickly.
Yes.
I remember that.
But, we've got the students at the University of Manchester are a bright bunch of students and they can manage, this is okay. And it's a bit of a transition between high school and college and university. But it's a transition that we get to. My goal actually in final year, and in year 2, it's sort of somewhere between the two, but in final year for undergraduate students, my goal actually is for the students to have the confidence and the self-efficacy to trust themselves. Because I'm not always going to be there for the students. You're going to be graduating from that degree program in the next year, and my colleagues are not going to be there to help you to write your assignments, to do your analysis, etc. So actually my goal is to create individuals who, with support, with scaffolding, can trust their own judgment, that they are now qualified in this area. And it's, in a strange way, it's kind of to make sure you don't need me anymore, and sort of to take students kind of through that journey, if you like. So some of the work that I've been doing in my own pedagogical research is around how students make use of their assessment feedback and the ways that we can help students to do that. So we can come back to kind of touch on that later. But I think you were alluding to what I'm doing outside of my own teaching. So 50% of my time at the moment actually is not as, it's not for the School of Health Sciences, it's for the university. So as Hugo was saying, I have a role which is of academic lead for teaching excellence and quality at the university. And there's two of us who hold this role. So there's me, there's also my colleague James Brooks in the Faculty of Science and Engineering. And we've taken this role together, but with slightly different kind of focuses.
Right.
So James in particular is focusing more on academic development. So particularly how can we support our staff to support our students? So teaching the teacher, kind of, if you like. It's much more complicated than that, but in sort of essential terms, he's looking at the staff sort of training for them. And I'm looking at sort of teaching excellence and something called the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework.
Okay.
So the TEF, Teaching Excellence Framework, is something that's run by the Office for Students. So this is a government-ish sort of body. And every few years, we have a Teaching Excellence Framework exercise. So the most recent one was January 2023, where all of the higher education providers in England, it wasn't a requirement for the devolved nations, but all the higher education providers in England made a TEF submission. So as part of this process, the Office for Students, their panel, consider objective data, so student satisfaction, student outcome data. But we, the university, also make a written submission, a written 25-page narrative for the ways that the university is supporting student experience and student outcomes. And there is an independent 10-page submission from the Students' Union. And at the University of Manchester, we made the institution submission and the student submission.
Gotcha.
So I was involved in that process at the time from the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health, where I was the Associate Dean for Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes for the faculty. I'm now the University Academic Lead for Teaching Excellence. And one of the things I'm doing is preparing the groundwork for the next TEF submission, which we expect to be, changes in government notwithstanding, other things notwithstanding, January 2027. So we're thinking about all the ways that the university is supporting students in different areas. So this includes assessment and feedback, it includes student voice, it includes the engagement with research and civic sort of bodies in this space. It includes lots of different elements. It also includes student outcomes. So this is do students succeed? Yes. So some of it's statistical and some of it's written narrative that provides context.
Gotcha.
Sorts of things that we're doing.
Gotcha.
So in that space, I've been thinking about assessment and feedback in particular. And there's a group at the university which was set up by the Associate Vice President, Gabrielle Finn. She's Associate Vice President for the university, called the Assessments for the Future group. And that group has got several sub-projects kind of sitting under it, which are working to improve assessments and feedback at the university,
so,
for example.
One thing that I'm curious about in what you've said is, you are kind of seeing how the university is performing when it comes to academic outcomes for students and their enjoyment of the courses that they're doing. So I'm curious if you have any particular conclusions that you've come out with for yourself about how it's going, because I'm quite curious about that myself.
So I think, in terms of how it's going, what is going?
For instance, are students generally enjoying the courses that they're doing? And if not, is there some systematic issue that you could be addressing as an academic excellence, academic
lead for teaching excellence and quality. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So I think students are not a homogenous group.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are different experiences, and I think every student is individual. I think something that at least I aim to do is for every student to be able to thrive. Now, for some students, they're facing really significant challenges. Right. Something that is in public discourse a lot at the moment is with the cost of living crisis. And you might have seen the university has just announced a sort of broader kind of bursary opportunities for students to kind of support students in that kind of space. So I think there are some kind of fundamental obstacles that we can help to remove. We can't solve all of kind of society's global kind of things. That there's an awful lot going on in the world at the moment. But there are some things that we can do. And I think the University of Manchester is moving in the right direction in many of these spaces. I'm also mindful of things such as awarding gaps, making sure that all our students have the opportunity to kind of thrive in whatever it is that they're choosing to do, and supporting students who might not have all the advantages that some of the other students have. And
so would that, for instance, mean, let's say you want to get a PhD at the University of Manchester, but maybe we see statistically that people from certain cultures or from certain places in the world are less likely to get them. Is that kind of what you mean by that?
That kind of space, yes, exactly. Okay. So there are lots of different kind of comparisons that you can make. But of course, even within those broad brush comparisons, there are individual stories to kind of be told here as well, of course. And, you know, just from my own perspective, I've had many advantages.
Yeah.
I have, however, been a woman in science. Not just a woman, but also a mother. I've got 2 small children, as you know, I've mentioned them previously in my lectures. So I try to just be mindful of the circumstances that all of our students are in, and that the advantages that I have might not be the same as the advantages that others have, and to try and pay that forward everywhere that I can.
Right. So just extending that empathy to experiences which you may have had no understanding of, being coming from where you're coming from.
Yeah.
I can appreciate that. Yeah. One thing that I personally found really fascinating was coming from different school systems. So I was in Poland, I was in the US, in the UK, and now in the UK again.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of moving around. Is just how different your circumstance can be. Because, for instance, when I was studying in the UK, in London, it was a fairly poor neighborhood.
Right.
And one of the things that I observed is that just people have this automatic learned helplessness to, for instance, assignments. It's just like, why should I do it? There's no clear idea of what value that's going to provide. And then in contrast to that, I went to the US, where it was almost like a posh school.
Right.
Like half of the students there were children of professors, of really like distinguished people. And you get a completely different sense for the attitude that you have. And it seems so fascinating to me and, you know, sometimes unfortunate that it seems like all that environment where you were placed in almost shapes the kind of attitude that you have, and the kind of opportunities that you have. Yeah. I mean, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but having come to the University of Manchester, I think in the span of 3 months, I had more opportunities to grow than I had for most of my life. So
that's wonderful to hear. Well, it's wonderful for the university, I suppose, to hear that. I'm sad that hasn't been your experience until then. But it's just, I'm just so pleased that some of the things that the university is doing is working for you. That's terrific.
It's incredible, and it is inspiring to see, because as students who will one day become, you know, some of us will be teachers, some of us will be important parts of industry, and so on and so forth, to actually get a sense of what's necessary to foster success in students and to foster success in younger people. So for instance, spaces like this, like where we are right now, this podcasting studio, this is not something that I built. This is something that someone else has built. And it's fascinating to me that just having those opportunities out there and providing them. Someone is providing them. I know who. It's Samuel Jackson. Shout out to Samuel Jackson and William as well. William Clark, I think. Just making an environment like that can help probably tens of students develop these skills, let's say in video production and so on.
Yeah.
And then they'll go on to make their own podcasts and their own, I suppose, outreach methods. And it just seems so crucial in building a better community in the long run.
Yeah.
So that's just something that I've observed having come from these different backgrounds. And so I'm wondering, when you look at the teaching that you do, is there that sense that you can support students in other ways other than just through teaching, for instance?
Yes. But actually, I think I try and do most of it through teaching. And do you know why I do that? It's because I'm trying to help as many students as possible, actually. So I teach usually quite large classes of hundreds of students. And you will have seen, even if you don't remember, that when students have queries, my preference is for students to please use the discussion board that's available on Blackboard, because then that means the question and my response are available to everybody and not just the one person who has got in touch with me. Because I think there might be correlations, patterns, biases in the kind of student who would contact me to ask a question. Similarly, the kind of student who might put up their hand in a lecture to ask a question and stop the learning for everybody else to get that question answered.
Yes.
That requires a lot.
Like me.
That's not where I was going.
Just kidding.
I was going to say that you need to have enough confidence to do that. And there are lots of reasons why a student might not have that confidence. But it might be students with particular protected characteristics who might be more or less likely to do that. And so I want to help as many people as I can. So some work that I did that started during the COVID-19 pandemic, actually, but I've continued to do and is now an arm of pedagogical research that I do, including with my final year project students, is looking at how we can help students to do this kind of thing. So during the pandemic, a lot of teaching became what's referred to now as asynchronous teaching. So it was pre-prepared materials that students studied at a time that suited them. They were available on demand for students.
Online videos, basically, for those who may not be familiar.
Yeah. So this had many advantages. Not all students had a quiet, suitable study space during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the staff didn't have those spaces to create these materials either. And so there were lots of advantages with that, but it became clear through student feedback that it also meant that something was missing. The sense of community, of shared experience, of connection was missing when we did that. So taking all of this on board during the pandemic, I tried to think about what I could do in my semester 2 teaching, having realized that what was happening in semester 1 wasn't really optimal. What can I do in semester 2 to improve this? So cast your minds back. So we're now in spring 2021. So we've just had a lockdown in the UK over that kind of winter period. And the teaching at the university, the large group teaching at the university at this time is online. It was a requirement that it, needed to be online. But it missed that sense of community. So what can I do to try and get that back? And I was the program director for the Cognitive Neuroscience and Psychology program at that time. I'm not anymore. It's now the wonderful Donna Lloyd who's taken that role. And during their welcome week, I ran a watch party. So I stole the term from streaming services, Netflix, Amazon Prime, etc. And it was in welcome week, and I found a documentary. And as a kind of a welcome New Year 1 students event, we watched together a documentary and we're chatting about it in the chat box over Zoom.
That's super cool, yeah.
So I did that as a welcome event, and it worked really well. And I was like, oh, this is good. And some of the chat was about the documentary, but we also had quite a debate on what the best biscuit was, including dunkability ratings, chocolate melty kind of speeds, that.
On a scale of 1 to 10, you try to operationalize it right away.
You can take the girl out of psychology and all that, but you can't take psychology out of the girl.
Yeah.
The winner, by the way, folks, was chocolate hobnobs. They were the outstanding winner.
Candidate.
Yeah, the king of biscuits.
Yeah.
Yes. But I started thinking about whether I could do something like that in my teaching. So I did in semester 2. And I did it in the cognitive neuroscience lab classes. So I divided these classes. So we're online, remember? I divided them into a watch party lecture and then a workshop where students would work in smaller groups. But the watch party lecture, if you like, was exactly that. It was pre-prepared videos that I had created. And then the students and me we were physically separate, but we got together in the same time and place on Zoom to watch these pre-recorded materials together and be discussing them in the chat box. I was trying to create this sense of shared experience and community and conversation, that it's the serendipitous conversations that you might have while you're in the queue outside a lecture theatre waiting to come in, or it's the turning to the person next to you in a lecture theatre, what did she say? Did you catch that kind of question? And it worked better than I could possibly have hoped that it ever would. I got special permission to come onto campus to run them because I was nervous about my home Wi-Fi being up to the task of hosting a Zoom call and streaming a video on this Zoom call to hundreds of students at the same time.
Right.
So I got permission to come onto campus to do it. And I treated myself to lunch from Pret on Oxford Road afterwards. I was a bit nervous about this. So it's like I'm live on Zoom trying to stream pre-recorded videos of myself. And you've set up a podcast, right? So you're probably used to hearing recordings of your own voice now. And it's hideous, right?
Hideous,
we all hate
absolutely.
it. Can you imagine how you feel watching a video of yourself with 300, 400 students on the call while you're talking and you're chatting about it? So I needed a bit of a breather afterwards. And I had students literally stopping me in the street to tell me how useful, how good they'd found this approach to learning. And I kind of thought, I'm on to something here.
Yeah, I mean,
and the chat box was on fire, during the lecture. I couldn't keep up with it. I had to apologise and say, I'm sorry, I can't keep up. I'm going to get to them all, but bear with me.
Yep.
It worked really, really well. So actually, I've kept the key elements of the format, even though we're now working back on campus.
Yeah.
So in your cognitive neuroscience lab classes next semester, you will have a lecture. You'll have lab lectures and workshops. And in the lab lecture, we will have a member of staff delivering the content and another member of staff sitting on a chat box that's projected onto the next screen. And I've been running controlled experiments with my final year project students in this kind of space over the last few years so knowing that students like it is certainly useful information.
Could you just flip around that?
Apologies.
No problem.
It's certainly useful to know that students like the format, but that just because people like it doesn't mean it's good, or it's good for their learning. So we might like something that's actually not very good for us, right? We can think of lots of other examples of that.
Yeah.
So I've been running controlled experiments to see if this does actually support students' learning. So I've run things online, I've run them on person, I've run them pre-recorded, not pre-recorded, chat box, no chat box, to see what this actually does to students' learning. And then we give them a test at the end of the session. What have you learned?
Yeah.
As well as other things. And
what have you found?
I have found and replicated that it replicated
Very
in an
rigorous.
independent. I'm a cognitive psychologist, right? Again, you can take the scientist out of the you can take the girl out of the science, but not the other way around. The chat box reliably improves students' performance.
Wow.
It's shown online. It's shown in person. We've also started to look at whether this is true for all students. So something I was alluding to before, are we advantaging the students who are already advantaged? Are we advantaging students actually who haven't got the advantages that some other students might have? So a couple of years ago, one of my final year project students was particularly interested in how this effect might interact with personality characteristics and particularly social anxiety. Now, this I have not replicated. I have not tried to replicate it. It's not that I've tried and failed. It's just that it hasn't come up again. But we seemed to find that students who were higher in social anxiety benefited even more from the chat box than other students did. Which might not be a surprise, right? Because on a chat box, you can get your question answered. You can get it answered anonymously, and you can get it answered by the member of staff or by another student. So if I had it when I was a student, you just miss something that the lecturer is saying, and that's it, you're scuppered for the rest of the session.
That's it, yeah.
This gets rid of that, because you just say, sorry, what was that you just said about X, Y, and Z?
Right.
And I, as the member of staff, actually, because I'm on the chat box, I've got access to Google. I can say, now, what was that paper that showed something? I can quickly look up the reference and say, here's the link for the student. So I give better answers. The students get immediate feedback. Everybody can see it. Everybody wins.
It's inspiring because it seems like a really clever integration of technology to learning that you might not have thought of otherwise. Because you think of in-person learning as the lecturer stands there and gives the lecture. You sit there and listen. But to actually have a chat box where you're kind of doing both at the same time.
Yeah. And that's actually what I realised afterwards. So my prediction when I was doing this work was that it was something about the shared experience, something about the sense of community. All the students are doing this together at the same time. There's a sense of cohesion that we lost. But actually, following up with some questionnaire measures, I have worked out that that's part of it. But actually, another part, and possibly a bigger part, is the connection with the member of staff. I had essentially, by pre-recording the lecture material and then being on the chat box, I'd cloned myself, because I was simultaneously delivering the lecture. And students, they'll write in their feedback forms. You get sent surveys at the end of the units, right? Please fill them out, folks. We do read them, and really, we do take action from them every year. But students would write in there that, so one student said, I felt like I had Jen as my own personal tutor, and she was sitting next to me, and we're talking about neuroanatomy.
Imagine, and you can do that with a 300-person lecture hall,
right?
Or whatever format you did it. You didn't do it in a lecture hall, did you?
Well, I have now done it in a lecture hall, and you will have in semester 2. So I don't tend to have the videos pre-recorded, because I now have a second member of staff. When it was just me doing it, I cannot literally deliver a lecture and answer a chat box at the same time. I can't do it. But if you've got another lecturer, and now I do, to answer the chat box, then you've got one person delivering the live content who can then react. So the thing about pre-recording a video is I can't feel the room at the time. So I can't see all the students going, huh? Or even, hey, or anything kind of in between. I can't feed off that. Whereas if you've got someone delivering it live, they can use that kind of social rapport that you have with the group of students to kind of tailor what you're doing. And you've got the chat box at the same time. And so it reliably improves students' performance, at least in the controlled experiments as I measured it by multiple choice question test. Insert the usual caveats here about whether that also applies to a lab report, for example, but there's certainly no evidence that it's harmful, and I think there's actually evidence that it helps.
That's right. But it also we assess people with multiple choice questions anyway.
We do.
That's the best measure that we found. So
it's certainly one way to do it. But we also have tested sense of community. There are published scales on sense of community, and the chat box also reliably improves.
Oh, that's great. Wow.
So it's. I mean, you say it's quite clever, and I kind of think, well, is it really? It's a chat box on a screen, and I pinched the idea from popular streaming services. I guess I just happened to do it in the right place at the right time. I suppose I followed it up as well because I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I know why it works.
And then we robust. So people building on your research, for instance, in other universities, they can be like, you know what, it's definitely happening.
Proven.
Well, as often seems to be the case in science, you will often have different people doing the same thing in different places at the same time. So during the pandemic, I'm not the only person who tried watch parties. So in fact, some psychologists in the University of Glasgow, so Emily Nordman and Carolina Kupper-Tetzel, were doing the same thing at the same time that I was. And they've written a lovely paper actually on their reflections of their experience. So it's not something that's even just me. It's not because I'm doing it. It's other people are doing it as well. And it seems to work.
That's really fascinating. If it's okay, I remember I was reading a book. It was such a dry book, but it was quite interesting in what I've gotten from it. Its name was Chaos Making a New Science. And one of the things that was instrumental in developing chaos theory was the kinds of developments in mathematics that were happening in the 50s and the 60s. So there were some researchers working in the US and in Russia, so the Soviet Union, independently. And they had no contact whatsoever between each other.
Yeah.
But they were coming to the same conclusions at basically the same time. So that just blew my mind. I was thinking, for such a long time, I was thinking, you know, what if we didn't have an Einstein? And would we even have an equivalent theory that would, you know, inform all the research and the discoveries that have been happening over the last 100 years? But this book made me realize, you know what? I think there'd just be another dude. His name would be like Weinstein or something, and he'd take his place. So
there might very well be. I mean, we're all living on the same earth.
Yeah.
And many of the constraints that we have. So something like a global pandemic, like COVID, lots of the higher education institutions were doing the same thing at the same time. So I don't think it's a surprise that under that kind of selection pressure, to use the evolutionary kind of term, that we might have come up with similar solutions.
Yeah, I think in the example that you gave, it's interesting because I guess the stakes are so high. And the professionals so expert and masterful.
And it seems like it'd be such a creative, unreproducible result. So some mathematician somewhere in Russia figures out that, I don't know, by having an infinitely foldable geometry, you can somehow predict chaos. And it's just like so mind-blowing that you'd think no one is ever going to come up with an equivalent theory. And then someone else, basically in the same year, in the US, comes up with the same kind of theory. So you just think, like, how does that happen?
It's surprising how often it happens. Actually. It's these aren't isolated cases.
I like to think because the people are so good at what they do, and because the stakes are so high, and the fact is just there waiting to be found out. If you give them the same amount of time to do it, they'll probably just end up doing the same thing. It seems like there'd be it almost points to like an existent abstract truth that is out there. I wonder if, I know that there's many views that scientists take on, you know, is there some abstract, I don't remember what it's called exactly. Is it, yes, anyway, there is a sense that everything is more relativist. And then some people believe that there is a more, a truth that exists out there, and we just have to find it. So I wonder, from your view as an existing scientist who's working in cognition and teaching, which ideology would you fall along that spectrum, and if there is maybe some nuance to that view in your case?
I don't think I've got a clear answer for you there, Hugo.
Okay. More philosophical, I guess.
Well, perhaps. I would like to think that there were fundamental truths in the universe and that we can discover them. But I think I've continued to be surprised by what I've learned in my scientific life, that I wouldn't want to assume that is the case. Just because I like something to be the case doesn't necessarily mean that it is. And, you know, similarly we were having a conversation earlier around control of action and free will, and is it as free as I like to think it is, or am I forced to the conclusion that I find a little bit uncomfortable, that we might be a little bit more determined than I would like to think that we are? So these are things that I think about kind of quite often, but ultimately I think for scientists, speaking only for myself actually, I suppose, it's that I want to find out what the truth is.
Yes.
I'm a human and I have biases and I do have preferences about what I want that truth to be, but I would like to think that I would accept whatever that truth
You find some objective, invariant truth.
And I would, even if it made me feel uncomfortable, I hope.
You hope that there would be something like that.
I like to think so.
Yeah, because in particular in psychology, we have this challenge of being in a different culture means you have completely different outcomes on this survey, for instance. And we use this survey, I don't know, to measure academic outcome and outcome in your work, and maybe even things like your intelligence. And people in different places may not fall as favorably on these things, but we find so often that that's just because we've adapted it to our little tiny circle or little tiny context. And if we extended that context, all of a sudden everybody seems to be doing kind of the same. Like there's fewer differences between people. So I wonder if you've had reflections on the immense variability between people, and whether that is something that you have to consider constantly in your research.
I absolutely consider it constantly in my research. Yes, I think to quote the late Joe Cox, who was an MP, I think we have far more in common than that which divides us.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm thinking of my own research, a lot of the time I'm thinking about those things that we have in common.
Mm-hmm.
So to take out the individual variability, to get to what persists beyond that individual variability. But I think it is also absolutely critical to be aware of that individual variability. It's something that we were talking about earlier with different students are different. And if we have something like a chat box, actually this might help support students who might kind of benefit particularly from support. So I think studying those individual differences between individuals, or cultural differences between cultures, being aware of these things and how this affects our worldview and our perspective, because I think it probably affects absolutely pretty much everything. I think being really mindful of that, while also having the kind of the fundamental truths that exist beyond those differences. I think they're both important. I'm not sure that answered your question, Hugo.
You know what? I've asked a fairly abstract question, so an abstract answer is quite appropriate, actually. One thing something you said earlier touched upon, I thought was really interesting, was when you've been doing that research with students and seeing if the chatbot works. I thought to myself, couldn't every teacher do something like that? And would it be possible to maybe integrate it on a more systematic way? And is that something that you're thinking of doing right now as in your role?
Yes. So I think the key is for us to evaluate the things that we do so that we know what works. So we can try lots of different things and see what works, but then the key is to communicate what works and what we've tried that didn't work, and so that we can then embed that into the things that we're doing. So things like having a chat box presented on a screen was really effective where I did it. I haven't tried it outside the context in where I did it. Now, I don't have any reason to think that it would be different if the subject matter was different. I mean, so the lab classes where I tried this happened to be on the cognitive neuroscience of empathy. I don't have any reason to think that topic is specific to this approach having worked. But it could be. But I think so what seems to have been key from the controlled experiments, once I did the watch parties and then tried to run the controlled experiments to tease out what the critical factors were, the critical factors seemed to be to have a mechanism to provide students with feedback from the member of staff in real time. I think provided that you can do that, it doesn't have to be done the way that I did it, if you see what I mean. I also don't think it needs to replace other methods necessarily of doing things. There are also other constraints that we might have. So I did this in the pandemic with pre-recorded videos on Zoom. I now run it in lecture theatres, but I've got a second member of staff. I couldn't do this if I didn't have that second member of staff, because I can't deliver the lecture while answer questions on the chat box at the same time.
You'd have to be a pretty extraordinary person to be able to divide your attention that much.
That would be really difficult. So I think there are constraints in where we can do things. There are, practical constraints, resource limitations.
Yeah.
I think the important thing to work out is where this is going to have the most impact, for whom, and to put it there.
Yeah.
So the psychology program is undergoing a bit of a curriculum review at the moment. I don't know if Duran spoke about that when you spoke to him.
Yesterday we had a student staff meetup.
Okay.
So he talked a bit about that. Yeah.
About that. So one of the things that we're looking at doing is in all the lab classes, should we take a similar approach to this one? What alternatives are out there? What do we think is going to be the best way to do this?
Got it.
Because I think the best way to teach and to help our students to learn might be different in different contexts and depending on what the goals are for that particular session. So I think for me, the important thing is to work out what works, to evaluate it clearly so that you know that it works. So how do we robustly evaluate something? So the surveys that our students fill out at the end of each semester for their modules definitely gives us useful information. But sometimes the response rate is a little bit lower than we'd like it to be. Is it a certain kind of student who fills out these surveys? Are we getting a particular kind of opinion? And opinion, again, we don't always know what's good for us, do we, as humans? So I think it's useful to have that objective measure kind of as well. And this ties into some work that I've been doing more recently, actually, on assessment and feedback for students. So traditionally in the literature, a lot of the focus has been on what makes the best feedback for a student. But the attention has been shifting slightly more recently away from what the teacher does towards what the student does with the feedback. And I think that's a really sensible question, actually. So there's some work, it's pilot work that's going on at the moment that I've been doing a little bit of with some colleagues. So the brilliant Jenny Rose. There are many Jens or Jennies doing things at the university. So there's Jenny Rose in the business school at the University of Manchester and Louise Walker in the maths department. So the three of us together have been looking at something called active self-feedback for students. So this is a little bit like students writing feedback for themselves on their work. So you might have a particular comparator. So that comparator might be an example first class essay or the marking scheme or comments from the teacher or something generative AI might have written. And then the student using that to then write themselves feedback. So, okay, I've just seen my peer's essay, my friend's essay. Having read that, how can I improve mine? And actually writing that down and the student writing that feedback for themselves. And there's some evidence actually that this is super effective in helping support students for various reasons. It comes at the right time for students. You don't have to wait for the teacher to give you the feedback. It's necessarily written in language that makes sense to you because you have written it. I don't know if you've ever had an experience where a member of staff has given you feedback and you've not quite understood what it is that they're asking you to do. And I'm sure it was clear to the person who wrote it. But if it's not clear to the student, how do you then action that? And it's something that I was sort of talking about earlier with my goal actually is for students as they progress through their journey to trust themselves. And so if this is a mechanism that we can use for students to help themselves to do this and something that they can take with them long after they've left and graduated, that would be such a better thing than being able to support a student just right here and now in this moment. If instead we can create mechanisms that students can take with them afterwards that's going to help support them in the longer term, I think that could be a good thing as well.
So it sounds like the best feedback a student can get is the feedback he gives himself.
I don't know. So my final year project students this year actually are going to be looking at this. So anyone watching or listening to this afterwards, if you're doing SEPS credits, you might get invited to one of these experiments. But so one thing we're going to be comparing, for example, we'll ask students to do a little task in the session and write something. And then there'll be different conditions. So one of them will be, I will give them feedback as somebody who marks students' work. I will provide feedback. We will also provide it for one group of students. For a different group of students, we'll provide an example first class piece of work. For a third group, we might just provide the marking scheme, the marking rubric, and say, using this, how would you improve your work? And the fourth one actually is going to be ChatGPT.
Okay.
So we'll put the work that's written by the student into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT, how would you improve this?
Mm-hmm.
And compare what comes back from these 4 situations. So using whatever this is, the student, the participant, will then write themselves some feedback. How will I improve my piece of work? And then improve it. So we can measure the before and after, the change, hopefully improvement in the mark.
Yeah.
In these 4 different conditions. And because we're using the SONA system, the SEP system to do it, we're not putting any students at risk here or advantaging some students in the work that's marked for their degree. This is a controlled kind of environment. But it's an authentic task. So come back and ask me in a few months what we find as to what the best kind of method for doing this is.
Do you have a directional hypothesis?
Good question. So I'm not sure anybody's tried comparing it to ChatGPT. So I'm not sure that one would be directional. Having had a bit of a play about with the feedback that ChatGPT gives, it's not always what I, as a member of staff whose marking work, is looking for. And so ChatGPT gets it wrong sometimes, right? So I couldn't comment on that one. I think that an example first-class piece of work might be useful. I would like to think that my comments as a teacher would improve students' marks. I'm not sure that just looking at the marking scheme would. Do I have a directional hypothesis? No, I don't think I do. But this is something that my project students are kind of driving forward. So they might have particular hypotheses that they're looking at as well. So we're also looking at personality measures. So things like students' perceived self-efficacy and self-confidence. Does that change how useful these different approaches are?
Right, because in this case, I'd imagine the self-written feedback would promote self-efficacy the most.
Might do. Yeah. Might very well do. Don't know the answers yet. You can ask me again in 6-9 months' time.
I was going to ask, when will the data be released? This could actually be quite useful for us to know.
Yeah, absolutely it could, so I like to replicate things, as you know. So this is the first time that I've attempted this. And sometimes we learn about how not to do things by trying to do them. So it might be that I don't have data for you in 6 to 9 months' time. It might be the year after that I kind of will have a clearer idea once I've replicated kind of the basic findings. But I've also kind of found that you need to be very careful sometimes about the advice that you give to anybody, because it can be difficult to undo that advice if it was the wrong advice. I've certainly taken the wrong advice several times in my life. I don't know if you have as well.
Half of my life has been wrong advice.
I mean, not just in the academic space, but just life in general. And it can be quite difficult to sort of undo a preconception. So I wouldn't want to say, this is the answer, unless I'm reasonably very confident that this is the answer. So chat boxes work.
Fair enough.
Wouldn't want to preempt what I'm currently doing on assessment.
That's why you're doing research, so you can actually confidently give answers when you're asked about it.
Exactly.
So that makes sense.
Yeah, I respect that caution.
Yeah, especially that most people, especially those who have a lot of outreach, the ability to outreach to a lot of people, usually don't have that kind of caution. It's just like whatever you say goes.
Confidence.
I'm
very confident for sure, but not supported.
I value it being correct.
Yeah.
And I'd love for science to be self-correcting. There's all sorts of things have been corrected because a new experiment comes along that says, oh, actually, that might not be quite right. And that's perfectly okay. But I think certainly if we're doing something that we think is going to affect people's practice, I'd like to be pretty confident that we're saying something that we think is true.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm curious about, I recall in earlier lectures, you mentioned that the science of psychology, so psychology has been quite a new science.
Right.
And when you look at older or more mature sciences, like let's say physics or mathematics, or even things like computer science, where there's been a lot of time to really delve into some specific theories and then generate specific hypotheses based on them. I wonder how you imagine the current development of psychology. And one thing that when you've been talking about the ways by which you, let's say, try to understand more how education should be done on a broad level, I guess, that to me it seems like this is something that it feels like we should have figured this out 2,000 years ago, the moment that we started education. But at the same time, I can appreciate that because things are changing all the time, and particularly in people and how we live our lives. This is not the same as with mathematics, where you can just write a theorem and then it's just like, yep, it stays the same for exactly, proves itself to be true for the next 40,000 years. So I think my question here is, do you feel that psychology is becoming more mature and that slowly these, I guess, incorrect hypotheses are getting whittled away, while the more accurate foundations, whatever they might be, like I think I was talking to Dr. Nils about this, and he mentioned that, for instance, the Stroop task has been just proven over and over again, and it now seems like a foundation for any research that you might want to do in that area.
You can't turn it off.
You can't turn it off.
Well, you have to inhibit it, right? Which comes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier. This speaks to the whole inhibition space. So do I think psychology is becoming more mature as a science? I think it's quite a philosophical question. I think first we need to ask ourselves what science is. And I think, speaking again only for myself, I think science is the method. So I think we could ask just about any question. We could ask, is the moon made of green cheese? But as long as we're using the scientific method of controlled systematic variables to get to the truth to what that answer is, I think I would call that science. Might change my mind about that. I think that's where I'm landing today. But I think psychology is a relatively young science, exactly as you were saying, Hugo. So if we look at things like chemistry or physics. So for example, my understanding of chemistry, which finished at A-level, is that we do now have a dominant theory for the structure of the atom.
That's right.
And that's gone through several iterations. So there were plum pudding models and things, from Rutherford. I think it was Rutherford. We have the periodic table of elements, but that went through several different researchers as well before it was final. And even was it Mendeleev who left gaps in his periodic table of elements? I think going back decades to my high school education here.
It might have been Mendeleev, but listeners, please forgive us if we don't remember the actual name. Maybe someone's going to tell us in the comments. We're going to have a chat about it, and then we're all going to learn more.
We're relying on Jen's decade-old A-level chemistry here.
Yes, but I remember that researcher who sort of invented the periodic table. He left gaps.
He left gaps because he knew that some of them weren't there.
Exactly.
That's
actually
so
figured
humble.
it out.
I love that.
Yes.
It's amazing. Well, I think it was Dmitry Mendeleev, but I might be wrong, who did that. Well done, whoever that was. So I think...
Imagine you could do something like that for psychology.
Right.
Like you leave a little
and that's
gap.
the question, isn't it? And do we have kind of a dominant theory of how humans work at the moment in terms of the mind? And I don't think we do. I think, for me, Bayes' theorem probably has come closest, but I don't think it's all the way there either. And as I said, in Year 1, Lecture 1, Introduction to Cognition, we have different theories for the different elements of cognition. So the theories that I talk about with attention are not the same as Nils will talk to you about with learning, as Jason will talk to you about with memory, as Leonie will talk to you about with language. We don't have a single theory that can do all of these things.
Right, exactly.
And I don't know if the same is true in the other disciplines. So in mathematics, it might be. In physics, I think somebody told me once that the theories governing the big things in physics are different to the subatomic things and you have different things according to the size of
That's
the
right.
thing.
They predict different things and they're mutually exclusive. So both cannot be
true.
Right.
So is psychology that different in that respect? If we have different things that explain different elements of the universe, is it that different?
Psychology, to me, I mean, my understanding is from you guys, basically, but it always had the sense that it was more fragmented amongst different sub-theories and different laws and different hypotheses. There's a lot of hypotheses.
Is that just a consequence of psychology's youth as a science?
I think it might be. I don't claim any particular expertise in the philosophy of science, but this is my understanding of it. And for me, I think a science is its method, and particularly it is the falsification. So I think it's Karl Popper kind of sense that we should try to our goal should be to falsify. And if we cannot, then we accept that it's true. Rather than look for confirmatory evidence, we should try to falsify. We should try to break it.
Yeah.
So I think if we continue in that sense, I think what we're doing here is science. I think it is a young science. I don't think we have the answer yet. I also think it's changing all the time. There's all sorts of, I've got 2 young children, and there's all sorts of conversations, in the parents' WhatsApps and at the school gates around the use of mobile phones in children. Particularly, the end of primary school, beginning of high school. Should we give our children mobile phones? And I don't think, and again, I claim no particular expertise in this space, but I don't think the data are clear. I think mobile phones, screen time, social media have a lot of advantages. There might also be disadvantages. Do I, as a parent, know what the right thing is to do here? No, but it's also not something that my parents needed to consider.
Yeah,
it's not something that parents. I'm old enough that I didn't have a mobile phone until I went to university.
Yeah,
and that's when I got my first mobile phone. And I think it was largely so my mum could ring me rather than I could ring my mum. It was a brick. I think it had Snake on it that I could play.
Oh, absolutely. I remember having a phone like that as well.
Well, my first phone.
Yeah, you could play Snake on it.
But we did, Facebook didn't exist when I was a teenager. You're not using Facebook anymore, are you? I've just shown you how old I am. There you go.
It's post Facebook.
Snap,
Instagram, WhatsApp,
all
TikTok.
those kind of, all those platforms, which, but it's something that I'm thinking about for my kids. And so the world is changing. People are changing. Generative AI existed, but it wasn't part of the public conversation 2 years ago. And now it very much is.
Yeah.
So
almost every conversation that we have, it's
around artificial intelligence. But I mean, but I told you folks in Introduction to Cognition, Alan Turing, who worked in that building over there for a while, and the Turing test. What's going on in the brain is something that we've been thinking about for millennia. Well, maybe not millennia, but hundreds of years. Certainly, and definitely for decades. So, yes, I think it's a young science. Do I think there'll be a unifying theory? I don't know. I think humans are complex.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Maybe physics isn't as complicated.
Yeah.
I'm sure the physicists would argue with me about that one.
Absolutely.
But,
yeah. So when you mentioned physics and how it actually doesn't yet have a unifying theory either, I thought to myself, because humans are complicated, because we're literally made from hundreds of billions and trillions of individual cells that are jiggling around, it seems like it'd be difficult to find a principle around which all of that variability, that constant variability, like some people are born in completely different circumstances, they have different brain chemistries and all that stuff. So even on a structural level, it's like
there are infinite variables.
Yeah, exactly. Infinite variables constantly acting upon people.
Can we ever pull it out?
Exactly. So can we even pull something like that out and try to find some kind of structure that would encapsulate it all? But it seems like to some extent we can. We've done it, right? Like, I mean, we wouldn't have microphones if we didn't find some kind of structures, some kinds of invariances within the variance.
But I think that's what we have in psychology.
Yeah.
If we discover something that applies only to one individual and only under very, very precise circumstances, is that useful?
For that person.
Might be useful. Certainly could be. And I think it comes back to something I was saying earlier about, I think we have far more in common than that which divides us. And if we can pull out those truths that exist beyond the variance, I think that's very useful too, as well as understanding that variance. But what exists beyond that variance? So for my PhD, I was looking at visual attention, and that's useful information insofar as it applies broadly. If it only applies under very, very specific circumstances, that might still be useful information to know that. but I think it's useful to understand what kind of works across the board as well.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about why that knowledge is useful across the board?
Okay, so practical applications sort of wise. So thinking here just of visual attention. So let's take a really simple example, and then we'll have a more complicated one. So if I said to you, you're traveling, you're going to a hotel. It's a hotel you haven't been to before, in a city you haven't been to before, and you want to check your hair. You want to know what your hair looks like. So you're looking for the mirror in your hotel room. Where are you looking for the mirror? Where do you think it is?
Bathroom.
Yeah, where?
Above the sink?
On the wall above the... Perfect. You have learnt through experience, presumably, that that's where the mirror is likely to be. You have picked up that statistical regularity in your environment, and so you can now make predictions about where that's going to be. I think that's incredibly useful. If you're going, again, a trivial example, you're going to a supermarket, and it's the same supermarket you usually go to, and they've removed something. Am I the only one that gets really like
they put the meat on a different aisle?
Like you've changed things around. I think being able to pull out those statistical regularities in our environment is really useful to us. And those are trivial examples, right? More complex examples. So a visual search task. The examples I gave you were looking for letter T's or letter L's on a screen, and they might be brightly coloured. Yeah. But can we think of examples of where we use this skill? For instance, searching for tumours on mammograms. What are the factors that make it more or less likely that whoever's looking at that will successfully identify a tumour and successfully reject a not tumour? Or something dangerous on airport baggage scans. And I think that one's particularly interesting. I remember talking about it in the lecture. How often do we think the airport baggage handlers find something that really is a problem?
Probably once every millions.
Not very often. So it's a really difficult task, but the consequences of them missing it could be horrific. So it's a constant high cost vigilance task, but it keeps us safe. Or the way a lot of attention research started out was in auditory attention. And the story I tell you in year one lectures is it's when human beings learned to fly in aeroplanes, because now we needed air traffic controllers. And when aviation was just getting started, the air traffic controllers typically, as I understand it, would have a single loudspeaker that had the intermixed pilots' voices all coming out of a single loudspeaker. Wow. And those intermixed pilots' voices were invariably male pilots' voices, which makes it even more difficult to tease out the different messages.
They were all named John too.
Maybe. So I think being able to understand what means that we can do these tasks, we can do them reliably, and how this applies broadly across individuals, knowing that one individual can do this might not be very helpful, or knowing they can do it under these circumstances. What we want to know is how to make it so that lots of individuals can do this, and what circumstances they need in order to be able to do this effectively. How can we make the air traffic controller's job easier? How can we make it so that radiographers looking at scans of people's bodies correctly reject the non-cancerous blobs that they can see, and successfully accept and say, this one's something we need to pay attention to. We don't want to perform surgery if there's no malignant cancer there to remove it. That's a cost to the patient. To say nothing of the financial cost or the time cost for the NHS or whomever is performing that surgery. But we definitely want to get the ones that we need to act on. So I think understanding attention and how we do these things and how we can make it better and easier for people is really helpful. But thinking again of teaching, how long do you think you can pay attention to a lecture for? So if you just think back to my lectures, how often do I put a little activity in? Or when I was doing this during the pandemic and I would create videos, did I create one long video? Did I put it into 10, 15, 20-minute chunks and then have an activity between them? Why did I do that? I think we can take a lot about what we understand about attention and learning and memory and use this practically.
Yeah.
Does that help?
That's a good answer.
That makes complete sense. And one thing that you've pointed out here, which I just recently had a wonderful opportunity to explore this area of research. But yesterday we had a lecture about convolutional neural networks as part of the University of Manchester Data Science Society.
USIL.
Yes.
A USIL unit.
No, it actually wasn't a USIL unit.
Okay.
It was just a society event. They actually do extremely wonderful work. There's a guy named Alex Buburazan, and he's the president of that society, and he's basically been a lecturer for us for the last few weeks on things like AI, machine learning, things like that.
So it's a student society?
It is a student society. It is wonderful. Yeah, we're even thinking of partnering up with him, myself as co-leading the Artemis project, which is part of the Robotics Society. Yeah. So we're thinking of making a connection there because we're working with AI, machine learning.
Brill.
And I think their students who are more familiar with that area could contribute a lot to our work. But anyway, a little bit of a tangent. The point I wanted to make was yesterday we were learning about convolutional neural networks. And what struck me was just how similar they are to actual eyes and how eyes process information. So it literally, first you apply a little transformation. So for me, it was the equivalent of a ganglion cell, which kind of combines inputs from hundreds of different rods and cones.
Photoreceptors.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then it just becomes more abstracted and summarized through successive networks in the brain in the occipital lobe. And in particular, relating to what you've just said about, taking, making attention the focus of your research and finding those statistical regularities.
Right.
That is something that right now with machine learning, we can actually model, we can produce it. So yesterday when they were talking about convolutional neural networks, which are essentially ways of seeing through a machine, of interpreting meaning, picking out meaning from a machine, it was a mathematical way of finding statistical regularities. So for example, the John's voice in the stream of other Johns.
Right.
If you're an air traffic controller, and then acting on that. So we were working with actual scans. I think it was CT scans, maybe. Anyway, some kind of scans, black and white, of different parts of the body. And some of them were pictures of the liver, some of them were pictures of the lungs, etc. And it was fascinating to see how those machines, through maybe like 5-7 minutes of training, were capable of beginning to identify all these different objects. So like, this is the right spleen, this is the left, et cetera, et cetera. And it just seems so wonderful how now, as psychologists, we almost have like another tool that we can be using. Because imagine 70 years ago, you had nothing like this. You had nothing where you could quite literally model the human mind, applying the same sort of rules that it's governed by, which seems like the mind is attuned to picking up patterns and things. That seems to be the goal. And in those machine learning algorithms, like the convolutional neural network, CNN, let's just call it that, it seems to do the same thing. So I'm wondering if in your research right now, I mean, you've mentioned that you are looking at how ChatGPT could give you feedback, but I'm wondering if there's some additional places where, especially as an attention, memory, and learning researcher, whether you've been using tools like that, and if not, is there a potential for you to use them or use them in collaboration with others?
I'm sure there would be potential to do so. It's not something that I've kind of been doing. So I think, though, that I would draw a distinction here between models of, so something like a neural network, and an artificial intelligence of some kind. So an artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, others are available. My understanding of the way that they work is that they're not trying to emulate a human brain. So they're large language models. They are predicting what the next word, etc., would be in that sentence. It's kind of a word association sort of thing. And it's producing something that it looks like it might be intelligent. Although, funnily enough, you can make ChatGPT trip up remarkably easily because of the way it works. And we can compare that to models of systems that are designed to replicate the way a human works. And to do that, I think it needs to succeed and fail the same way that a human would succeed or fail. The mechanism needs to be the same. So long before ChatGPT, we would have computers that could play chess, for example. And we could put the computer, like Deep Blue, as it was called, against the chess grandmaster, Gary Kasparov or similar. And the two would work out the next chess move in very different ways. And so I think the first thing I might do is draw a distinction between these things and which of these it is that we're discussing. Are we talking about a tool such as ChatGPT or Deep Blue for those of us who are a bit older? Are we talking about a tool that we might be able to use? So generative AI, for example, can spot tumours in X-rays. And it sometimes can do it better than a doctor, but not always do it better than a doctor. And why not? And it's a tool, I think, that we can use, but it's not trying to do the same thing that the human is. And I think we can compare that to, and I'm not sure what the CNNs are doing, but I'm getting the sense that it's more, what is it doing?
Well, it's a bit complicated. So CNNs, convolutional neural networks, essentially their goal is, let's say you have an image, a 1518, 518 by 518 image, just 518 pixels, a little square, and it has a cat on it, right? So essentially, when you have a neural network, its goal is to pick out the essential details from it so that it can
identify a cat in a novel picture.
That's right, for instance.
Gotcha.
And what a convolutional neural network is supposed to do is create different sorts of, I believe it's called kernels, and adapt those kernels to more effectively identify the essential details. So one example of a kernel is, and this was something that I just found so fascinating because it was so similar to what an eye does, is a kernel that specifically picks up lines, edges
at a particular orientation.
Yeah, so
like the receptive fields.
It is exactly like that. It is exactly like that. So first, maybe one kernel is going to pick up the outlines, another is going to pick up some other feature. It's really complicated. Like, I don't know exactly what identifies a cat. It's a mystery of the mind to figure out why it's a cat and not, say, like a fox or a dog. And how we were so able to so consistently identify it. But the neural network just tries, through trial and error, to increasingly identify those features to then be capable of pulling out those features in particular in successive images. So let's say I have a cat in the forest, and then I have a cat in the house. The irrelevant features are the context, so the environment within which it's in. The relevant features are maybe the whiskers and the ears and maybe some other components of that cat, like maybe its fur. So its roughness, you could say. And so convolutional neural networks, their purpose is to create kernels, which then pick out those features. Then you stick it into an actual neural network. So basically like a model of the brain, model of the brain.
So it's designed to emulate the human.
Yes.
I think. And it's so interesting that you would use that example of the context. I don't know if this anecdote is true or if it's apocryphal and has just been passed down from successive people. But I was told when I was a student about a computational neural network which was trained to tell the difference between wolves and dogs. And it turns out that the way it was doing it was because of the background that the animal was presented on. Was it presented on a green background like a park, in which case it's a dog? If it was in the snow, it was a wolf or something like that. That actually the researcher, when he was talking to his grandson, again, as the story goes, his grandson, when he was walking him to school, said, "Oh, look, there's a dog in that park." And the grandfather, the researcher, said, "How do you know it's a dog?" And the little grandchild said, "Because it's on a lead." And you sort of think, okay. So it is, even though perhaps that computational neural network that was looking at the background, is it green or is it white, to determine if it's a dog or a wolf, actually maybe the human is doing something vaguely similar to that. It's because it's about whether it was on a lead.
Yeah.
So it sounds as though what we're talking about here is can we replicate what the brain is doing, rather than is this a tool that we can use like ChatGPT that is not doing necessarily a human brain is doing. I certainly think there is scope to do that in the kind of research that I certainly have been doing. It's not something I personally have done.
I'd love to continue this conversation next time. It was really fantastic. Yeah. I know that you have to go in a few minutes. Thank you very much, Jen. It was wonderful talking to you. Marshall and I are just overjoyed to have you on. And honestly, anytime we have a guest on, it's just always a wonderful experience.
It was great fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Conversation today.